The rain lashed against the windows of the small apartment on the outskirts of Ashford City, a relentless drumbeat against the glass, mimicking the frantic rhythm of Chloe Carter's heart. She was 13, and sleep had been a fragile friend since the argument last week. But this was different. Not the familiar rise and fall of her mother's voice, sharp and then conciliatory, followed by Julian's deep, soothing tones. No, this was a guttural, terrifying silence, punctuated by disturbing sounds. Chloe lay rigid in her bed, buried beneath a quilt that suddenly felt paper-thin, offering no solace against the encroaching dread. Her small room, usually a sanctuary of posters and half-read books, now felt like a cage. Through the thin wall separating her bedroom from the living room, she could discern a struggle, a muffled thump times, that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the usual domestic squabble, the kind that made her pull her pillow over her head and hum to herself. This was raw, visceral. She heard a choked gasp, a desperate, strangled sound that could only be her mother, Emily Carter, and then a man's voice, low and menacing, a growl that peeled back the veneer of charm Julian Thorne usually wore. It was a voice Chloe had never heard him use, devoid of its usual captivating warmth, now laced with an icy edge that sent a shiver colder than any winter wind through her. Her breath hitched. Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in her stomach. Every muscle in her small body tensed, urging her to move, to call out. But a primal instinct, stronger than any courage she possessed, rooted her to the spot. Her imagination, usually a vibrant playground, now conjured grotesque images behind her closed eyelids. She heard the distinct, sickening crash of something heavy. A lamp, perhaps, or a coffee table, followed by another, deeper groan from Emily. Then, a sound that would forever etch itself into the darkest corners of her memory. The distinct times, schlick times of metal against something yielding, wet and soft, followed almost immediately by a piercing, guttural scream. It was a sound torn from the deepest well of pain and terror, a sound that didn't just vibrate in the air, but seemed to rip through the very fabric of her being. Her mother's scream. The scream ended abruptly, truncated, leaving behind an echoing void. Then, silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that pressed down on Chloe, stealing the air from her lungs. It was worse than the screams, worse than the struggle. It was the silence of finality, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her entire body trembled uncontrollably, a tremor that started in her fingertips and shook her down to her toes. The rain continued its mournful drumming, the only sound in a world that had suddenly become horrifyingly quiet. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Chloe didn't know how long she lay there, paralyzed by a terror so profound it felt physical, a crushing weight on her chest. Finally, driven by an unbearable need to know, a morbid curiosity that warred with her instinct for self-preservation, she slowly, painstakingly, pushed aside the heavy quilt. The room was bathed in the faint, flickering glow of a distant street lamp, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with silent menace. With agonizing slowness, each movement an immense effort against the rigid fear, she crawled off the bed. Her bare feet met the cold wooden floor, the chill a sharp contrast to the burning heat in her chest. She crept towards the door, which stood ajar, a slender sliver of darkness leading into the unknown. Her hand, clammy with sweat, reached for the knob, but she hesitated. What if he was still there? What if he was waiting? Mustering every ounce of courage she possessed, Chloe nudged the door open just a fraction more, creating a narrow gap through which she could peer. The living room was bathed in the same muted, spectral light as her bedroom, the weak glow filtering in from the streetlights outside, distorted by the rain-streaked window. She saw overturned furniture, the faint glint of something reflective on the floor. And then, a figure. It was Julian Thorne. His back was partially turned to her, his tall, imposing silhouette framed against the muted light. He wasn't bending over, wasn't frantically searching. He was standing still, eerily calm, about 3 feet away from the shape sprawled on the floor that Chloe knew with sickening certainty was her mother. Emily lay motionless, a dark, growing stain blooming beneath her. Chloe's breath caught in her throat. She clamped a hand over her mouth, muffling a nascent whimper. Thorne's head was slightly bowed, but as he moved his arm, the faint light caught his profile for a fleeting moment. His eyes, usually crinkling at the corners when he smiled, were cold, flat, devoid of any warmth, any emotion. They were the eyes of a stranger, a predator, utterly alien to the charming, attentive man who had laughed with her mother just hours ago. The smile she had seen on his face in countless photographs, the one that had so easily captivated Emily, was nowhere to be found. Only an emptiness, a terrifying blankness that chilled Chloe to the bone. In his hand, she saw it. A knife, long, slender, reflecting the ambient light with a sinister sheen. He held it with an unsettling casualness, and then, with slow, deliberate movements, he began to wipe the blade clean on what appeared to be a crumpled piece of fabric. There was no haste, no panic in his actions, only a chilling, methodical precision. The sight of him, so composed, so detached amidst the wreckage of her mother's life, was more horrifying than any angry outburst could have been. Chloe's heart pounded so violently she thought it might burst through her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, wishing, praying this was a nightmare, that she would wake up in her warm bed and find her mother humming in the kitchen. But when she opened them again, the scene remained, immutable, real. Thorne finished cleaning the knife, then tucked it away somewhere beneath his jacket. He cast one last, lingering glance at Emily's still form, a look that held no remorse, no regret, only a chilling sense of completion. Then, as quietly as a shadow, he moved towards the back door. He opened it without a sound, slipped out into the torrential rain, and vanished. The soft click of the latch was the final punctuation mark on a nightmare. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Chloe remained frozen, peering through the gap in the door. Long after Julian Thorne had disappeared, her mind was a whirlwind of disjointed images. Her mother's scream, the flat, dead look in Thorne's eyes, the glistening blade. It took an agonizing amount of time for her brain to register that the immediate danger was gone, for the paralyzing fear to recede just enough for her to move. Her legs felt like lead, her muscles screaming in protest as she pushed herself forward, out of her bedroom and into the dimly lit, chaotic living room. The smell hit her first, a coppery, metallic tang that was unmistakably blood, mingling with the damp scent of rain carried in on the night air. The floor was slick in places, and she had to step carefully, her bare feet shrinking from the cold stickiness. Emily lay on her back, twisted at an unnatural angle amidst the debris of what had once been their cozy home. A shattered vase, its delicate floral pattern now fragmented, lay near her outstretched hand. A throw rug was bunched up, stained crimson. Emily's eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, unseeing. Her usually vibrant red hair was fanned out around her head, matted and dark with blood. A choked sob escaped Chloe's lips. It wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. This was a movie, a terrible, gruesome story, but the coldness of the floor beneath her feet, the acrid scent, the terrible stillness of her mother told her otherwise. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice a reedy, broken sound. She knelt, her knees sinking into the damp carpet, but she couldn't bring herself to touch Emily. The sight, the absolute finality of it, stole her breath, twisted her gut. A guttural wail tore from her throat then, a raw, primal shriek that seemed to rip through the very fabric of the silent night. It wasn't a question. It was a release of pure agony and terror. And then a desperate, frantic need to times something. Scrambling to her feet, Chloe turned and bolted for the front door, fumbling with the lock, her hands trembling so violently she could barely grasp the cold metal. She burst out into the storm, the icy rain instantly plastering her thin nightgown to her skin, chilling her to the bone. She ran across the manicured lawn, slipping on the wet grass, ignoring the sharp sting of cold and the ache in her lungs. Her only thought was Mrs. Henderson's house next door, the faint glow of a nightlight in her window, a beacon in the storm. She hammered on the door, her small fists pounding against the solid wood, screaming incoherently. "Mrs. Henderson, please, my mom. It's it's Uncle Thorne." Lights flickered on inside the neighbor's house, and after a moment, the door opened a crack. Mrs. Henderson, a kindly, silver-haired woman in a floral bathrobe, peered out, her face etched with concern. Her eyes widened, seeing Chloe soaked, shivering, her face streaked with tears and rain. "Chloe, child, what on earth?" Before Mrs. Henderson could finish, Chloe collapsed against the doorframe, sobbing hysterically. He he killed her, Uncle Thorne. He killed Mom." The next few hours were a blur of flashing lights, frantic voices, and the sterile smell of disinfectant mingling with the lingering scent of blood. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, closer, until the small, quiet street was transformed into a chaotic tableau of emergency vehicles. Red and blue lights pulsed through the rain, casting macabre shadows that danced on the walls of the small apartment. Paramedics rushed in, followed by police officers, their somber faces reflecting the grim reality that Chloe had just articulated. Emily Carter was pronounced dead at the scene. The words hung in the air, cold and definitive, echoing the silence Julian Thorne had left behind. Chloe was wrapped in a thermal blanket, shivering not from cold but from shock, perched awkwardly on a folding chair in Mrs. Henderson's living room. The kind neighbor hovered, offering weak tea and hushed words of comfort that couldn't penetrate the thick fog of grief and terror. A man approached her, his figure looming in the doorway. He was middle-aged, with tired eyes set in a perpetually weary face, and a slight slump to his shoulders that bespoke long hours and too many grim scenes. He wore a dark suit, slightly rumpled, and introduced himself as Detective Miller. His voice was deep, soft, an attempt at gentleness that barely registered through Chloe's numbness. "Chloe, I'm so sorry," he began, kneeling down so he was at her eye level. His gaze was kind, but also probing, assessing. "Can you tell me what happened tonight, sweetie? Anything you remember?" Chloe hugged the blanket tighter, the fabric scratchy against her wet skin. He was in the living room," she mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. "Uncle Thorne, Julian." Miller's pen paused over his small notepad. "Julian Thorne? Can you describe him for me, Chloe? The man your mother was seeing?" Despite the chaos, the trauma, the dim light, Chloe's memory of Julian Thorne's silhouette, of the chilling emptiness in his eyes, was crystal clear. "He's tall, dark hair, kind of slicked back. He was wearing, I think, a dark shirt, and he had a knife. He wiped it on something." Her voice cracked, the image flashing behind her eyes, vivid and sickening. "He stood over Mom. And then he just left. Out the back door." Miller scribbled furiously. "You're sure it was him, Chloe? Julian Thorne?" "Yes," she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "I saw him. His eyes, they were cold, not like usual. He looked at her, and then he just left." She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the memory, but it was glued there, replaying itself again and again. The detective thanked her, his face grim. He exchanged hushed words with other officers, their conversation a low murmur that Chloe couldn't quite decipher, but she heard phrases like, "no forced entry," "no sign of a struggle from outside," and disappeared without a trace. The police investigation began immediately. Officers fanned out, knocking on doors, questioning neighbors. But it quickly became apparent that Julian Thorne was an enigma. He had charmed Emily into his life a few months ago, a whirlwind romance that had swept her off her feet. But beyond that, there was nothing substantial. No official records, no permanent address, no social media presence that could be easily traced. He seemed to have materialized out of thin air, a ghost with a captivating smile, and now he had vanished just as completely. They found a few grainy photos on Emily's phone. Emily laughing, her arm linked with Julian Thorne's, his head tilted towards hers, a dazzling, almost too perfect smile gracing his lips. In one, he was holding a bouquet of roses for her, his eyes twinkling. The man in the picture, so full of warmth and tenderness, was a stark, horrifying contrast to the cold, empty-eyed figure she had seen standing over her mother's body. Which one was real? Or were they both real? Two terrifying facets of the same monster. The hours bled into dawn, the rain finally subsiding to a weak drizzle. The flashing lights remained, a constant, irritating reminder of the night's horror. Chloe was numb, exhausted, yet sleep felt like an impossible luxury. Her world had shattered. Her mother, her protector, her anchor, was gone. And the man who had done it, the man she knew, with absolute certainty, was Julian Thorne, had simply evaporated into the night. She watched as the crime scene investigators meticulously combed through the apartment, their movements precise and detached. A plastic bag was brought out, containing what looked like a blood-stained shirt, another with a blurry photograph, perhaps one of the very ones from Emily's phone. Chloe's gaze lingered on the items, her vision blurred by unshed tears. The shirt, a symbol of her mother's life and death. The photograph, a cruel reminder of the deception that had led to it. A profound emptiness settled in her chest, a cavernous ache that no amount of comfort, no amount of reassurance from Detective Miller could possibly fill. Her mother was gone. Julian Thorne was gone, and Chloe was left, a fragile survivor, alone in a world that had suddenly turned dark and terrifying, with the chilling image of a monster's emotionless eyes forever burned into her memory. The hunt for Julian Thorne had begun, but it felt like chasing a shadow, an exercise in futility against a killer who had no past, no trace, only a horrific present that had just obliterated Chloe's future. She felt an unbearable impotence, a crushing weight of grief and injustice, as the rain outside finally stopped, leaving behind only the damp, cold silence of a violated home. The aroma of stale coffee and desperation clung to Eleanor Vance's small apartment, a familiar scent that often accompanied the relentless pursuit of truth. Outside, Ashford City was beginning to stir, the first hesitant rays of dawn struggling to pierce through the persistent gray of the Michigan sky. But inside, Eleanor, a woman in her early 30s whose sharp intellect was often overshadowed by a perpetually tired gaze, was oblivious to the nascent day. She was hunched over her laptop, a mosaic of newspaper clippings, printed police reports, and hastily scrawled notes fanned out across her worn wooden desk. Empty mugs littered the periphery, monuments to her nocturnal vigil. The Emily Carter case had burrowed deep into her consciousness, an insistent burr under her skin ever since the initial news broke, not just because it was a brutal murder, or because a young girl had witnessed it, though those details alone were horrific enough to warrant attention. It was the description of the killer, Julian Thorne. Charming, elusive, and his utterly seamless disappearance. Something about the narrative felt recycled, a discordant note in a symphony of tragedy that Eleanor, a seasoned investigative journalist who thrived on exposing hidden truths, couldn't ignore. She'd heard this tune before, played in different keys, but with the same chilling cadence. It was the whisper of a pattern, a shadow lurking just beyond the headlines. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, typing search terms into obscure databases and forgotten digital archives. She wasn't working for a major publication anymore. The grind of corporate journalism had stifled her spirit. Now, as an independent, she chose her battles, and this one felt particularly urgent. Her gut, a finely tuned instrument honed by years of sniffing out deception, screamed at her. There was an injustice here. Not just for Emily and Chloe, but for others, perhaps. A decade ago, a similar case had briefly flickered on her radar. A young mother, a charming boyfriend, a sudden brutal end, and an unsatisfying resolution. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the threads of these tragedies were somehow intertwined, waiting for someone to pull them taut. The initial hours were a frustrating dance with dead ends. Julian Thorne's digital footprint was virtually non-existent, a ghost in the machine. No social media, no definitive past addresses, no traceable employment history. He was a chameleon, a shadow. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, raking a hand through her already disheveled dark hair. This wasn't just a transient. This was someone actively erasing their tracks, meticulously constructing a new identity. That level of premeditation hinted at a darker past, a history that Emily Carter, in her romantic fervor, had likely never seen. She shifted her search parameters, widening the net. Instead of focusing solely on Thorne, she started looking for similar unsolved or suspiciously resolved cases involving domestic violence, charming perpetrators who vanished, or even those who received unusually lenient sentences for violent crimes against women. She cast her mind back to the vague memory, trying to recall fragments. A small town. Ohio, perhaps? Maple Creek, Ohio. The name surfaced from the depths of her subconscious, a faint echo from an old news bulletin she'd skimmed years ago, dismissed as just another regional tragedy at the time. With renewed purpose, she typed Maple Creek, Ohio murder 2015 into her search engine. The results slowly populated, and then a headline jumped out at her, stark and chilling. Local mother found dead. Boyfriend, Julian Blackwood, arrested. Her breath hitched. Julian. The name itself sent a jolt through her. She clicked the link, her heart beginning to thump with a frantic urgency. The article, an archived piece from the Times Maple Creek Gazette *, detailed the brutal murder of Sarah Jenkins, a 8-year-old single mother. The description of the perpetrator, Julian Blackwood, was hauntingly familiar. A charismatic stranger, the article read, who swept Miss Jenkins off her feet before slowly isolating her from friends and family, ultimately leading to her tragic demise. He was known for his effortless charm, his ability to disarm and captivate. Eleanor felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The parallels with Emily Carter's story were terrifyingly precise. She devoured the details. Blackwood had been arrested, tried, and convicted. The sentence, 18 years. A flicker of triumph, quickly extinguished by the next paragraph. However, the article continued, due to exemplary behavior and a successful rehabilitation program, Julian Blackwood was granted early parole and released after serving only 6 years of his sentence. 6 years. For taking a life. Eleanor felt a surge of cold fury. 6 years for a crime that had shattered a family, orphaned a child. And now, another woman was dead, another child traumatized. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a continuation, a predictable and tragic outcome of a system that had failed. Her investigation shifted focus, becoming a deep dive into Julian Blackwood's post-release life. It was a painstaking process, requiring her to dig into public records, parole documents, and even obscure social media groups dedicated to true crime or missing persons. She contacted former colleagues, leveraged her network of contacts in law enforcement, those who still trusted her, independent, often inconvenient, pursuits, and spent days sifting through digital detritus. Eventually, through a series of cross-reference data points, a partial driver's license record from a different state, an old landlord reference, a forwarded utility bill, she found it. The name change. Julian Blackwood, after his release, had legally changed his name to Julian Thorne, and his most recent known address? Ashford City, Michigan. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. The same man, the same modus operandi, a new name, a new town, and another victim. It was a macabre cycle, allowed to perpetuate by the very system designed to protect. The implications were staggering. Emily Carter hadn't just been unlucky. She had been a victim of a systemic failure, a tragic consequence of premature release and insufficient oversight. The chilling realization solidified Eleanor's resolve. This wasn't just about catching a killer. It was about exposing the gaping cracks in the foundation of justice. Her first priority was to speak to someone directly impacted by Julian Blackwood's first crime. She tracked down Gustavo Jenkins, Sarah's father. It took several phone calls and a persistent email campaign to finally secure a meeting. 2 days later, Eleanor found herself driving through the quiet, picturesque streets of Maple Creek, Ohio, a stark contrast to the violence that had once stained its tranquility. Gustavo Jenkins lived in a modest, well-maintained home, its age reflected in the gentle peeling of paint on the porch railing and the gnarled branches of an ancient oak in the front yard. He was a man deeply etched by grief, his face a roadmap of sorrow and resentment. His hair was thin and wispy white, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes, though clouded with pain, still held a piercing intensity when he spoke of his daughter. "Another one, you say?" Gustavo's voice was raspy, laced with a bitterness that decades hadn't dulled. He sat across from Eleanor at his kitchen table, a half-empty mug of cold tea before him. The air in the room was heavy, thick with unspoken memories. I told them. I told every damn person who would listen. He was a monster. He played them all for fools." Eleanor listened, her recorder running discreetly on the table between them, her gaze unwavering. "Everything," he spat, slamming a gnarled fist gently on the table. "I saw it in him. The way he looked at Sarah, like she was his property. Other women. Reports of violence that were dismissed as domestic disputes. They were just little things. Isolated incidents, the police called them. But I saw the pattern. I warned them when he was up for parole. I wrote letters, made phone calls, pleaded with the parole board. I told them he hadn't changed, that he was manipulative, that he would do it again." A tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. "Said he'd done his time. Showed remorse. Remorse. That man doesn't know the meaning of the word. He knows how to perform times it. He played them, Miss Vance. Just like he played my Sarah. And now, this Emily Carter, this poor woman, she paid the price." Gustavo provided Eleanor with old documents, copies of his letters to the parole board, incident reports he'd meticulously collected from various police departments, detailing Julian Blackwood's history of domestic abuse with prior partners. These were the red flags, the blaring sirens that had been silenced by a bureaucratic shrug. One report, from 2 years before Sarah's murder, described a fractured jaw, dismissed by authorities as an accidental fall after the victim, terrified, recanted her initial accusation. Another, a restraining order that was quietly dropped The pattern was horrifyingly clear. A history of escalating violence, deftly concealed by a facade of charm and a system eager to believe in rehabilitation. Armed with Gustavo's painful testimony and a stack of previously ignored evidence, Eleanor delved deeper into the administrative failures. She contacted the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, specifically requesting records for Julian Blackwood's parole officer. After navigating a labyrinth of automated systems and unhelpful receptionists, she finally secured an interview with a former parole officer, a weary woman named Brenda Davis, who had handled Blackwood's case briefly before a departmental transfer. Brenda, speaking off the record in a coffee shop on the outskirts of Columbus, paint a grim picture of a system stretched to its breaking point. Julian Blackwood, she said, stirring her lukewarm latte, her eyes scanning the room as if expecting to be overheard. Yes, I remember him. Charming, to a fault, always had an answer, always a reason why he missed a meeting, why he was late reporting, and he did miss meetings. A lot of them. Eleanor leaned forward, her pen poised. How many is a lot, Miss Davis? Brenda sighed, running a hand through her thinning hair. He was supposed to report weekly, then bi-weekly after his first 6 months of good behavior, but he stopped showing up consistently about 8 months after his release. The last formal check-in we had for him was almost a year and a half before this Emily Carter murder. A year and a half? Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. And no one noticed? Brenda's eyes held a mixture of resignation and guilt. We noticed. We sent out a few warnings, tried calling. But the caseload, Miss Vance, it's astronomical. I had over 150 parolees at one point, many of them with violent histories, drug offenses, sex crimes. We're constantly triaging. If someone isn't actively committing a new crime that gets reported, or if they're just slipping through the cracks by not showing up but not causing any new times trouble that we know of, well, they get put on the back burner. We just don't have the resources to hunt down every single non-compliant parolee immediately. We issue warrants, eventually. The official records Eleanor later obtained confirmed Brenda's account. Blackwood had been non-compliant for over 18 months, his file marked with a growing list of missed appointments and unanswered calls, culminating in a low-priority warrant for his arrest that had remained unserved. The system had, quite literally, let him walk free, giving him ample opportunity to disappear and resurface as Julian Thorne. And then there was the psychological assessment, or rather, the lack thereof. Eleanor discovered that, while a basic risk assessment had been conducted prior to Blackwood's early release, it was a superficial, box-ticking exercise. There was no deep psychological profiling, no thorough evaluation of his psychopathy or his deeply ingrained manipulative tendencies. The focus was on reintegration and minimizing recidivism through superficial metrics, rather than truly assessing the inherent danger he posed. The emphasis was on saving prison costs and reducing overcrowding, not on public safety. The evidence mounted, a damning indictment of a system designed to protect, yet fatally flawed. Julian Thorne was not just a lone wolf. He was a symptom of a much larger illness. He was a man who had been given a second chance he didn't deserve at the cost of innocent lives. Eleanor worked tirelessly for the next week, fueled by adrenaline and a burning sense of justice. She organized her findings, meticulously cross-referencing every detail. The similar descriptions of the victims and the perpetrator, the identical modus operandi, the undeniable link between Julian Blackwood and Julian Thorne through legal documents, and the shocking record of systemic failures that had allowed him to reoffend. The old police reports, Gustavo Jenkins's testimony, Brenda Davis's confessions, the parole documents, it all painted an undeniable picture. Julian Thorne times was times Julian Blackwood, and he had killed again because the system had failed at every turn. The article she wrote was a bombshell. She didn't mince words. She didn't soften the blow. Titled "The Ghost in the System: How a Convicted Killer Slipped Through the Cracks to Murder Again." It laid bare the entire sordid truth. She detailed Chloe Carter's harrowing testimony, Emily Carter's tragic end, and then meticulously unwound the horrifying saga of Julian Blackwood, Sarah Jenkins, and the judicial oversights that had led to this preventable double tragedy. She included Gustavo Jenkins' heart-wrenching plea and Brenda Davis' stark admission of an overwhelmed parole system. Eleanor sent the piece to a major national newspaper, a contact she'd cultivated years ago. They recognized the explosive nature of the story immediately. It hit the stands and the internet with the force of a tsunami. The public reaction was instantaneous and seismic. Outrage erupted across the nation. Hashtags demanding justice trended online. Political commentators dissected the story. Lawmakers called for immediate investigations, and local news stations picked up the story, highlighting the systemic flaws. The story of Julian Thorne, Blackwood became a national conversation about criminal justice reform, parole accountability, and victim protection. Within hours of the article's publication, the Ashford City Police Department and the Ohio Department of Corrections were forced to open full internal investigations. Detective Miller, looking more haggard than ever in a televised press conference, confirmed that they were indeed pursuing all leads linking Julian Thorne to Julian Blackwood, acknowledging the new and compelling evidence brought forward by Eleanor Vance's reporting. A nationwide manhunt for Julian Thorne, now definitively identified as Julian Blackwood, was officially launched, elevated to top priority. But the bitter truth remained. Julian Thorne had vanished again. The increased scrutiny, the public outcry, the nationwide manhunt, it had all come too late for Emily Carter. He was a phantom, having likely used the head start afforded by the system's failures to flee the country, or to burrow even deeper into the anonymity he so skillfully crafted. Eleanor's article had shaken the foundations, forcing accountability and action. But the killer himself was still at large. Days later, Eleanor received a small, handwritten letter from Gustavo Jenkins, simply thanking her. He said that for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope, a sense that Sarah's death might finally mean something, might prevent another tragedy. It was a small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. In Ashford City, the rain had returned, a soft, persistent drizzle, mirroring the lingering sadness in the air. Chloe Carter, thin and pale, stood before the mirror in the temporary home she now shared with Mrs. Henderson. Her eyes, still haunted by the unspeakable horror of that night, flickered with a raw vulnerability. The images were still there, burned into her mind. Her mother's silent form, Julian Thorne's emotionless gaze, the glint of the knife. But now, amidst the crushing weight of her grief, a tiny, fragile spark had ignited. Eleanor Vance's words, broadcast on every news channel, had given a name to the monster, and a voice to the profound failure that had allowed him to destroy her family. Justice, though still elusive for Julian Thorne, no longer felt like a completely impossible dream. The system was now on trial, forced to confront its own silent sentence, and the question of how to protect its most vulnerable hung heavy in the rain-filled air, waiting for an answer.